Welcome to Guerrilla Discipleship. My name's Kevin Baker. I'm your host. If you were with us last week, we're going to continue the interview that we began last week, where Doug Kozub is interviewing me. If you remember or were with us, Doug has been working with Crew, helping churches plant churches. He and his wife and family have been planting churches overseas in China, and he has discovered disciple-making movement training and has been interviewing me about what we're seeing and how we're living into new disciple-making techniques as we pastor here in the North American context. So let's get right back to the interview. Thanks for joining us.
When you're a traditional church, and then you felt the Lord calling you to become more discipleship-making, how did you manage that change? Did you have elders read books on it? Did you have a core leadership retreat? Because you're talking about changing the culture of the church. It's not just changing. The problem isn't necessarily training. The problem is changing the culture of the church. And How did you begin doing that process?
I can't remember. That's a great question. I cannot remember who said this, but someone has said culture eats strategy for lunch all the time. In other words, a lot of us focus on what's the right strategy. But if you don't get the culture shift, I don't care what strategy you use, you're not going to see the change that you want. So it's a great question. And I would say that that we've used a variety of tools, a variety of methods, and by no means do I think we've accomplished it. We've started it, but we are not to the place where I would say we've accomplished anything.
That's fair.
And I think that probably everybody's in a unique situation, but I can tell you ours was this. From a leadership point of view, going into probably 2016, I think we were getting to the point in some ways where we were wholly frustrated. There was a sense within the leadership that we were realizing that, I think early on, we were realizing that some of the program model for church in the U.S. isn't very sustainable. And it's not sustainable, especially if you really care about disciple making. In the program model where it's sort of the Disney World model, right? We got to have enough new rides, enough new shows, and enough revamped things to keep people coming and to hold on to them long enough so that we can see if we can disciple them. But what ends up happening is you spend so much time and energy on buildings and budgets and programs and staffing that you often think, well, we didn't quite get around to disciple making yet. And so we began to experience a bit of that frustration in 2016. It's about the same time that I was reading a book called The 4 Disciplines of Execution, business book that I had gotten at a conference.
Great book.
It is a great book. So I said, I read this book and I was feeling the frustration myself. And I said, probably, if I would compare our church in terms of thinking about the church being a disciple-making factory, and you've got people coming in, and if they stay with us for a while, that they go out fully formed disciples, if that's a possibility. And I kind of compared it to a Coca-Cola bottling factory. And I said, well, if I owned a Coca-Cola factory and I had all these empty bottles coming in, and I looked at the end of the assembly line, and I got basically 10% of the bottles going out with Coke in them, I got a real problem. And so when I looked at what we were seeing, we had plenty of people coming in, plenty of people here. But when I looked at the product, I felt like we're about 10% of really what I would say 10% of the people. Have we had any significant impact on them as being disciples of Jesus? So we began to just tear into that and say, how do we change that? How do we get closer to 100%? And so it began to revamp everything that we were doing. And so I had the staff and the board read the book, The 4 Disciplines of Execution. We began to read a couple of other books. We actually went back, believe it or not, to the Bible and said, how did Jesus do it? How did Jesus, disciple people? What was his technique? And then, of course, that eventually led us almost by accident, got us introduced to disciple-making movement training. And once we got exposed to that 8-week training, it kind of wrecked us. It did wreck us. It wrecked us in terms of so many different paradigm shifts. We probably went through 36 paradigm shifts in 8 weeks. And if I hadn't had the staff and the leadership to process it out, and I've trained, at this point, I've probably trained close to 70 pastors in disciple-making movement training. And I see it all the time. Those who get the paradigm shifts, but don't have anyone to live this out with, to work it through, to just say, how are you doing this?
Great point.
You end up slipping back. You can't maintain these new frameworks, these new ways of thinking without support, encouragement, and some kind of infrastructure to begin to play it out. If all you've got is the old model infrastructure, man, you're just going to be drawn back into it. And so one of the things that I was blessed to have here is about 30 folks who went through the training with me so that we would sit around and go, oh my gosh, what do we do about this? And we would argue about it. I mean, we were sitting there going, is this biblical? And then we would go, this is clearly biblical, but how did we miss this in the scripture? I've been pastoring for 27 years. How did I miss this? And I fully concur. I mean, my wife and I, we helped start 17 churches in Hawaii and China. And I come home and then crew trains DMM and I'm going, what is this? Like, how come somebody didn't tell me this when I started my church plan back in 2003? I mean, it's like, I cried. Yeah. Believe me, we have cried. We have gotten angry. We not at the Lord or each other even, but just like, oh my gosh. And it's hard work to make this. This is, to me, when Jesus said, if you're going to come into the kingdom, you have to come as a little child. I think he knew how hard paradigm shifts are for us. And, a child makes paradigm shifts because they don't have old paradigms. They just have blank paradigms and they can absorb new paradigms very easily. Most of us who've been operating for any time in a Western church model, we are going to find ourselves in the same way that Nicodemus was like, how do I go into my mother's womb again? And that's really kind of where we were, is like, how do we do this? And so I think that's the critical place that for this to take hold in traditional churches, we're going to have a group of courageous leaders who are going to be willing to go through the agony of paradigm shifts and have a cohort of colleagues that they can sit and pray with and talk with, which is why ongoing coaching is so critical. Otherwise, we're going to default back. And when the pressure comes, we're just going to go back to what we know, because it's hard to...
Sure.
It's a little bit hard to ride a horse backwards and forwards all at the same time. You got to choose your direction. And DMM and disciple-making movement training is a little bit like turning you around on the horse and going, some of what we've been doing is just backwards, and we've got to rethink how we've been doing it.
It reminds me of the African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And one of the DMM principles or sayings, and you may have heard this, is that you go slow to go fast, because you've got to get some time for people to understand these things. Jesus spent 3 years, but then the church blew up when the day of Pentecost came, because he had formed them to be unbelievable recipients of a paradigm of the kingdom that as soon as the empowerment of the Spirit came, it could go, and it's still going. But most of us in church ministry, I have a friend who just went to a small church. I think it's about 30 people, and their average age is probably 75. And this was one of their questions for him in the hiring process. They said, "What are you going to do to grow our church?" It's a typical Western question for a pastor, right? What are you going to do to grow our church? Now, he had gone through the training with us. And so he said, well, I'm going to help you all become disciple makers, and you're going to go into the world and make disciples. And it may not grow this church, but it will grow the kingdom. Now, the remarkable thing to me is they asked him back for a second interview.
Yeah.
And they actually ended up hiring. So the reality is, what I said to him, he felt like after he answered the question, because he knew it wasn't what they wanted to hear, he called me and he said, there's no way I'll get this job.
I ruined it.
Yeah. And what I said is, listen, here's the great thing. You can live in with integrity into what you answered for them. There's no bait and switch with you. You're not promising that you're going to grow their church only to go in and say, well, what I really want to do is disciple making in a way that's probably different than what you're used to. And I said, so if God opens the door for you to go, you just have integrity with how you interview. If he doesn't, then God's probably saving you from banging your head against a wall that would have been frustrating for you anyway. So we'll see what God does. He's only been there for a couple of months, but it's going so far. I think it's going well.
That's nice. That's great. Did you craft a slogan?
No.
How did you make this thing become part of your culture at the church? You use the Sunday morning announcements, using prayer time the Sunday morning, using leadership training. It's like guerrilla warfare and making the culture of the church now slowly transition towards DNM principles. I like the slogan question. I had coined the term guerrilla discipleship and had written kind of a paper for it, just internal paper on it for our board and staff several years ago, realizing in ways that I couldn't put my hands on that the institutional church in the U.S. and in the West was not being effective, had lost its effectiveness. And I was trying to get, and I remember the first time I presented the concept of guerrilla discipleship to the staff. I can't remember what was going on in the world, but it was whatever. I don't remember what year it was, but there was some international things going on that people were like, "Oh, this is not the kind of term you want to use." And I said, "Well, I agree with you that it's it casts this idea of warfare. It's sort of hand-to-hand combat kind of thing." But I said, "But if you think through the concept well, it really is what Jesus instructed his disciples to do. It was how he trained them. He sent them out 2 by 2 as guerrilla fighters of kingdom. But their battle is a spiritual one, and their weapons are spiritual weapons, and their goal is love, not hate or destruction." So I allowed that to simmer. We didn't do a lot with that. But the biggest slogan that we've been using recently is one that I think I stole from Roy Moran. And I have every opportunity that I get, I use the slogan, "Let's be spiritually obvious without being spiritually obnoxious." And I'm pretty sure Roy Moran is the one that coined that phrase. And I love that. And I say that over and over again on Sunday morning. I say that in almost every conversation I'm having, encouraging people, because we have been socialized and enculturated in the church and in our U.S. culture that you have to be careful where you open spiritual conversations. Yeah.
And so I've been trying to fight against that by saying, I believe there is a spiritual hunger in our culture, but I do believe that people are tired of hearing Christians telling them what to believe. But I don't believe people are tired of discovering spiritual things for themselves. And if we'll open the door for a discovery, they're willing for us to be spiritually obvious. They want us to be spiritually obvious if we're not obnoxious. So I have used Roy Moran's phrase more than, again, I think I'm attributing it correctly. I think it's his, but I have co-opted that. I try to give him credit everywhere I can. But the reality is that's done more to begin to help shift culture, that slogan, than probably anything else. And people have embraced it. And I think they're really beginning to realize, and what I say is, test me on this. Begin to be spiritually obvious and see if people are hateful towards you back. I just was out before I came here. I was out at lunch with a guy, and our waitress came over and wanted to take our drink order. And then she came back to get our food order. And I said, listen, after she got our food order, I said, hey, my friend and I are going to pray in just a second for the food. And I got her name. Her name was Evie. And I said, Evie, can I just ask you, how could we pray for you? I want to include you in the prayer. And she thought for a second, and she said, I need free school. And I didn't know what she meant at first. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, well, I work here full time, and I'm a student at the university, and I need help with my tuition. And I said, well, I said, my God's a big God. I'm going to ask him to provide for you in whatever way he wants the finances you need for school. And I said, now don't be surprised at how God's going to answer this prayer. So I'm going to be praying for you. And she thanked me and walked off. She didn't ridicule. She wasn't upset. I think she was grateful. Now, she may never give it a second thought, but God heard that. And I asked God, my friend and I asked God,
I don't think she's going to forget that.
I hope not. And so I don't know how God's going to answer that question, how God's going to answer that need. But
you're hitting one of my passions, and that is in the Philadelphia area. I was just telling my wife this morning, I'm having so many conversations with people about God.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily Christianity all the time, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Man, there's such a spiritual hunger here. This is a gold mine. Mine. And we're going to start a DMM church. Tyler and myself, we got to get kicked out of a house earlier this year. We're in the parsonage here to church. We're kicked out next week, and we're going to another place part-time, another place part-time. Like, when I figure out where we're actually living, we're going to be starting a church. Well, that's what I do. We start churches. So I'm going to start another church. But boy, Philadelphia is so hungry for spiritual truths. It's true.
I believe our whole country is hungry for spiritual truths, but we've allowed the narrative of our sort of secularism and a bit of anti-Christian sentiment that's growing in our culture to say, you can talk about religious things, but don't talk about Christianity. And so what I'm trying to say to the church is just be spiritually obvious. Don't wear your Christianity on your sleeve necessarily. Don't be ashamed of of the fact that you're a follower of Jesus, but open with spiritual conversations and spiritual opportunities. Ask people if you can pray for them. I've had people say no, but I've never had anybody get angry that I've asked if I could pray for them. Not once in my life have I had anybody angry at that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Or you just ask them questions.
Yeah. Hey, I don't want you to. Now, it's not, I've had people say, you can pray for me, but not now. Like I've said, could I just pray with you right now? They're uncomfortable about that. Okay, no problem. I'll just pray for you. I didn't ask the waitress to stay. I said, we're going to be praying for our meal. How can I pray for you? She gave me the answer. And I said to her, I have a big God who's able to do anything. If he could do one amazing thing for you, what would it be? And that's when she said free tuition. I said, okay, well, ask.
Amen. Give her free tuition, Lord. Knock her socks off.
Amen.
Well, I sure hope you enjoyed that interview. I hope you'll come back next week. We've got some more talk and conversation about what are the changes the church today in America needs to make so that we can be more effective in making disciples. So we'll see you next week.